Look at this deer. It's not sleeping, it's not grazing. It's not even scared in the way you'd expect. A predator would make it bolt in half a second. But right now, staring at a small flickering light in the distance, it is doing something stranger than running. It's doing nothing at all. 4 seconds might not sound like a long time to you. But in the animal kingdom, 4 seconds of total stillness in the face of danger is an eternity. 4 seconds is long enough to be eaten, long enough to lose a herd, long enough, in evolutionary terms, to lose everything. And yet, across nearly every species on this planet, birds, deer, rabbits, wolves, even insects, the same reaction happens the moment they encounter fire. They freeze. Not fight, not flight. Freeze. Today we're going to answer a question that sounds simple but goes surprisingly deep into biology, psychology, and even into your own brain. Why do animals freeze when they see fire? And by the end of this video, you'll understand why this reaction isn't a flaw. It isn't animals being dumb around danger. It's actually one of the oldest, most calculated survival mechanisms nature has ever built, and it might explain a strange habit or two of your own. Let's get into it. Most people have heard of fight or flight. It's one of those phrases that's leaked out of biology textbooks and into everyday conversation. You feel threatened, your body picks one of two options: attack the threat or run from it. But that's incomplete. Real science recognizes at least 3, sometimes 4, responses to danger: fight, flight, freeze, and in some cases fawn. And when it comes to fire specifically, freeze is almost always the first response an animal defaults to, not the last resort. Here's why that matters. Fight or flight are both decisions. They require the brain to calculate. How big is the threat? Which direction should I move? Is escape possible? That kind of calculation takes time. Time an animal often doesn't have. Freezing, on the other hand, isn't really a decision at all. It's a reflex. It happens before the thinking part of the brain even finishes processing what's going on. It's the fastest possible response an animal has, faster than turning to run, faster than deciding to attack. Think of it like this. If fight and flight are like typing out a full sentence, freezing is like hitting the emergency brake. No thought required, just stop. And when the danger in question is fire, that emergency brake makes a strange kind of sense. Let's talk about why. For most of animal evolution, the number one threat to any prey animal was another animal, a predator. Something with eyes, a direction, a pattern of movement you could learn to read. If a lion is stalking you, you can watch its body language. You can predict where it will move. You know that if you run fast enough in the right direction, you might survive. Fire breaks every single one of those rules. Fire doesn't stalk. It doesn't have a single direction. It doesn't slow down when it's full, and it doesn't get tired. It can move faster than almost anything on land under the right wind conditions. Grassland fires have been recorded moving faster than a galloping horse. It can surround you before you even register that it's spreading. It can appear to chase you around obstacles because it's following wind currents, not intent, but from the animal's point of view, it might as well be a predator with a mind that never stops hunting. In other words, fire is a threat. An animal's brain has almost no ability to predict. And when a threat can't be predicted, the safest first move, biologically speaking, often isn't to run. It's to freeze and gather more information. That pause exists for a reason. Let's go inside the brain and see exactly what's happening during it. When any animal, including you, detects a sudden, ambiguous threat, one of the very first structures to react is a small almond-shaped cluster of neurons called the amygdala. It's often nicknamed the brain's smoke alarm, which in this case is almost too perfect a metaphor. The amygdala's job is not to think, it's to react. It scans incoming sensory information, sight, sound, smell, for patterns that match danger. And it does this in a fraction of a second, long before the more analytical parts of the brain have caught up. When it detects something like fire, the flickering, unpredictable movement of light, the smell of smoke, the crackling sound, it sends out an immediate signal that triggers the freeze response. This is sometimes called tonic immobility in scientific literature. Here's the clever part. Freezing does 3 things simultaneously. First, it reduces detectability, Movement is one of the biggest triggers for a predator's attention. By going still, an animal instinctively reduces the chance that something else will notice it and take advantage of the chaos. Fires often flush out prey animals, and where there's chaos, there are frequently predators waiting at the edges to pick off panicked animals. Freezing, paradoxically, can make an animal safer from a second threat while it assesses the first. Second, it buys processing time. While the body stays still, the brain is working furiously behind the scenes. Eyes track the movement and direction of the flames. Ears listen for the crackle and roar to judge distance and intensity. The nose samples the air for smoke density, which can indicate how close and how large the fire actually is. All of this happens in the freeze window, usually somewhere between 1 and 10 seconds, though it can be longer during extreme threat. Third, and this is the part most people don't expect, freezing conserves energy for what comes next. Explosive movement, like a full sprint away from danger, requires an enormous sudden release of energy. Muscles need to be primed. Adrenaline needs to spike. That priming happens during the freeze. It's not paralysis in the sense of being helpless. It's more like a sprinter crouched in the blocks, coiled and ready, waiting for the exact right moment to explode into motion. So the freeze isn't a failure of the nervous system, it's a feature. It's the brain running a rapid risk assessment while the body prepares its best possible next move. Now here's a genuinely fascinating wrinkle in this story. Fire, as a regular environmental threat, is actually a relatively recent thing in the history of life on Earth, geologically speaking. Wildfires have existed for hundreds of millions of years, ever since plants first produced enough oxygen and fuel for combustion to become possible. But large-scale, frequent wildfire pressure on animal populations really intensified far more recently, particularly as certain landscapes, savannas, temperate forests, dry woodlands became more fire-prone due to climate patterns. This raises an interesting question for scientists. Is the freeze response to fire something animals evolved specifically for fire? Or is it something older, more general, that fire simply activates because fire happens to check every box on the ambiguous, unpredictable threat checklist? Most researchers lean toward the second explanation. The freeze response almost certainly predates fire as a major selective pressure. It likely evolved originally as a general response to any sudden, novel, or unpredictable stimulus. A loud noise, a strange shadow, an unfamiliar smell. Fire simply happens to be one of the most intense, most unpredictable stimuli an animal is ever likely to encounter, so it triggers this ancient circuit particularly hard. In a strange way, fire is almost a perfect storm for the freeze reflex. It moves like a predator, but it doesn't behave like one. It has no eyes to avoid, no scent trail to lose, no den to escape it in. Every single sense an animal has is screaming, "Something is very wrong here." And none of those senses can tell the brain exactly what to do about it. And when the brain doesn't know what to do, it doesn't guess. It waits. Not every species freezes for the same length of time or for the same reasons, and looking at the differences tells us even more about how this system works. Deer, elk, and other large herd herbivores tend to freeze the longest, sometimes for several seconds, because their survival strategy already depends heavily on group vigilance and coordinated movement. A lone deer bolting too early can separate itself from the herd, which is often more dangerous than the original threat. So freezing allows the herd to assess together and often move as a unit once one animal breaks the freeze. Rabbits and small rodents freeze almost instantly and often stay frozen for a very short but intense burst because their entire survival strategy is built around not being seen in the first place. For a rabbit, movement is the single greatest risk factor in any dangerous scenario, fire included. Their freeze is essentially camouflaged by stillness, buying just enough time to determine whether fleeing to a burrow is possible. Birds show one of the more interesting variations. Because they have an escape route unavailable to ground animals straight up, their freeze window tends to be shorter. Many bird species will freeze only briefly before taking flight, since flight itself is a far more reliable and immediate escape from ground-level fire than it is from, say, a stalking predator. Reptiles, being cold-blooded, actually present a uniquely dangerous version of this story. Their muscles depend on external temperature for peak performance, so in cooler conditions a snake's freeze can last significantly longer simply because its body isn't physically ready to move quickly yet. This is part of why reptiles are disproportionately vulnerable during wildfires. Their freeze response, so effective against predators, becomes a liability against a threat that doesn't stop for anyone. Insects and social species like ants show something different altogether. Not so much individual freezing, but a kind of colony-level pause, followed by remarkably organised evacuation behaviour. Some studies on ant colonies facing fire have observed the colony rapidly forming defensive balls or organising structured evacuation lines, suggesting that, even at this level, freeze first, then move with purpose, holds up as a survival pattern. Across every one of these variations, the underlying principle stays the same. Freezing isn't the absence of a strategy, it's the first phase of one. Now, it's worth being honest about something. This system, as clever as it is, isn't perfect. It evolved over millions of years to deal with fires that behaved a certain way. Smaller, slower moving, more localized. It was not built to handle the scale, speed, and unpredictability of the massive wildfires we see in many parts of the world today, especially as climate conditions create larger and faster spreading fires than animals historically had to contend with. When a fire moves fast enough or spreads unpredictably enough due to shifting winds, the freeze response, that few seconds of pause built for information gathering, can become a liability instead of an advantage. Wildlife researchers and conservationists studying the aftermath of major wildfires have consistently found that slower moving and less mobile species, along with young or injured animals, are disproportionately affected, in part because the freeze-then-flee strategy simply doesn't leave enough of a window when a fire is moving at extreme speed. This isn't meant to be a grim note in the video. Most animals, most of the time, do escape, precisely because this system evolved to work under the vast majority of real-world fire conditions. But it's an important reminder that instincts built over millions of years are tuned to an average set of threats, not every possible extreme. Nature doesn't optimize for perfection. It optimizes for good enough most of the time. And for most of evolutionary history, freezing before fire was exactly that. Here's where this topic gets a little too close to home. You've probably experienced a small version of this yourself. Maybe you smelled something burning and for a strange half-second you didn't move, you just stood there, processing. Maybe you saw a spark, a candle tip over, a pan catch fire, and your very first reaction wasn't to grab the fire extinguisher, it was to simply stop. That's not you being careless or slow-witted. That's the exact same amygdala-driven freeze circuit we've been talking about this whole video, still fully active in the human brain. In fact, fire safety researchers have specifically studied this phenomenon because it has real practical consequences. During building fires, a notable number of injuries and fatalities are linked not to people panicking and making poor decisions, but to people freezing, sometimes for a genuinely dangerous length of time, before finally moving to evacuate. This is actually why fire safety training emphasizes rehearsed responses so heavily: fire drills, muscle memory, practiced evacuation routes. The goal isn't to eliminate the freeze response because you probably can't, it's baked in far too deep. The goal is to shorten it by giving the brain a preloaded plan so there's less unknown information to process in the moment. When the brain already knows what to do next, the freeze window shrinks dramatically. In other words, that deer standing motionless in the clearing and you standing frozen for a half second at a stovetop spark are neurologically running the exact same ancient program. Millions of years of separation between species, and somehow this one circuit never got the update. So let's zoom out for a second, because there's a bigger idea buried in all of this. We tend to think of survival instincts as being about speed, the fastest gazelle, the fastest reflexes, the quickest decision. But what the freeze response teaches us is that survival just as often is about information. An animal that reacts instantly without understanding the threat can just as easily run straight into danger as away from it. A rabbit that bolts the instant it senses fire might run in exactly the wrong direction. A deer that panics immediately might separate from the group and lose the safety that comes with numbers. The pause, That strange, almost unsettling stillness we started this video with is nature's way of saying, don't act until you understand, even when everything in you wants to move right now. It's not weakness. It's one of the most sophisticated risk management systems evolution has ever produced, refined over hundreds of millions of years, running in brains far simpler than ours, and yet somehow arriving at the same fundamental logic. So the next time you see a deer standing motionless at the edge of headlights, or a bird pausing before a flame, or even catch yourself frozen for a half second at the smell of smoke, you'll know exactly what's happening. It's not fear taking over. It's 400 million years of trial and error compressed into a single silent, calculated pause. If this made you look at animal behavior a little differently, you'll probably enjoy digging into more of the strange hidden logic behind instincts we usually take for granted. Subscribe if you want more of these deep dives. Let me know in the comments. Have you ever caught yourself freezing before you moved during an emergency? I'd genuinely like to hear it.